the painting on the wall. Lou sat pensively for a while in front of the moss-covered grave. His eyes absent-mindedly looked around at the sky and clouds, looking back at the quiet space at this moment. Human life truly has gone through too many fates, as well as too many rhythms that make people think. As for the life of the girl who died in the grave, part of it could be due to the young man's foolish gullibility, and part of it could be due to her blindness and love. The story of the moss-covered grave ended. Mr. Tren stood up again and continued walking to another grave. This new grave was completely separate from the others. It naturally stood alone in the cemetery. The nearest grave to it was probably at least a dozen meters away. This grave was overgrown with grass, just like an abandoned grave that no one had cared for a long time. Wall-hanging flowers. Old Tren walked closer to the grave, raised his skinny hands and pulled out some tall weeds, revealing the grave inside. After pulling out the weeds, he sat down on the ground, pointed at the grave and said, "The person who died in this grave also had a very unfortunate death, a death that had to be exchanged for his life. If the owner of this grave had not died, perhaps many people would have lost their lives because of the thing buried with him." Lou turned to look at old Tren and asked, "What kind of person is the owner of this grave, uncle?" Old Tren looked up at the sky for a while, thought for a long time and then said, "I don't remember very clearly, this person died a long time ago. I don't know about his work when he was alive, but about his personality, I think he was a very good person, a true hero." Lou sat listening to Mr. Tren speak very seriously. He sat there quietly waiting for this person's life story to be revealed by Mr. Tren. Mr. Tren said, "Before he died, he left me a suicide note. Said to bury him with that thing, so that the nightmare would end forever." Question. Did he meet you before he died? Old Tren nodded and said, "Not only did he meet me, but he died in front of me." Liao's eyes widened in surprise. In other words, the person lying in this grave had committed suicide in front of old Sheng. What could have happened that could have driven a person to such a dead end? Lou looked intently at old Tren, waiting for a satisfactory answer. Old Tren paused for a moment, then began to recall the old story. The story was recorded in the suicide note of the person lying in this grave. The story about a painting. Ha Duong Kam is a famous painter and has received much praise in the professional world. His paintings are often abstract, sometimes very difficult to understand in many aspects. But if people can contemplate the beauty in them, know how to look at them in a very special way, then those paintings are unique. However, fate did not smile on him because his life was also very short. When he had just completed a work considered the greatest of his life, he died. He died suddenly with a surprised look on his face. People saw him collapse in front of his painting and his hand spread out with 2 fingers placed on his face as if he wanted to gouge out his eyes. The famous painter Ha Duong Kam has died, the news of which has shocked the art world. Ha Duong Kam's last painting is considered the most expensive work of all time and was auctioned off by his family shortly after. A record high price has been paid for a painting by a Vietnamese artist. More than $10 million for an art painting by Ha Duong Kam, and it was bought by a Vietnamese expatriate who recently moved from the US to Vietnam to settle down. Although the painting was auctioned and successfully purchased, there are still many people who want to hunt for the painting, as a kind of hobby of discovery. There are many people who want to see the last painting of Ha Duong Kam, to see what secret is hidden in that painting that can make the painter Ha Duong Kam so surprised to death. However, since the owner of the painting sold it at the auction, which was also the last time, his identity has not been found, nor has the painting's whereabouts been determined. The incident was like that, almost forgotten by everyone. Many people thought that the last painting of Ha Duong Kam would never be able to be admired again. But no, 2 years later the painting reappeared. This time, people heard the same news as before. The owner of that painting had died, an untimely death due to panic, due to myocardial infarction, just like the late painter Ha Duong Kam before. When people discovered his body, they saw that he also seemed to have deliberately tried to gouge out his eyes so that he wouldn't see something. The painting reappeared in public, and this time was put up for auction. With two unusual events that happened to its previous owners, the price of the painting has been pushed higher than ever. A price of $25 million has been offered for a painting. People have never seen a painting by a Vietnamese artist fetch such a record high price. Continuing with the same story as before, the next owner of the painting also had the same fate as the previous two. He also lived in seclusion for 2 years with the painting, then died a similar death. This aroused suspicion and curiosity in many people. What secret did that painting hide? While public opinion was in an uproar over such a matter, the government also got involved. An incident involving a single painting, which had resulted in 3 deaths, raised a huge question mark. The authorities wondered whether there was a person who had murdered all 3 people in the same way. They did not believe that people would just look at a painting and then roll over to die. That was an extremely stupid explanation, and only childish people with shallow thinking, art fanatics, or superstitious people to the point of madness could think that it was due to panic. An investigation team was established, led by Hong Xian Dan. Dan was responsible for finding clues and narrowing down the events related to all 3 victims, looking for possible suspects who might have harmed all 3 people. Could it be that the killer was an art lover but he didn't want the painting to be owned by someone other than himself, so he killed the victims? But that question was quickly denied by Dan, because if the killer loved art so much, he should have killed the victim and then taken the painting. So why did he leave the painting behind? Dan thought about this problem and immediately came up with a strict line of reasoning. It was very possible that he wanted to fake the deaths to be natural so that the authorities could not find any clues, only thinking that this was a case of sudden death. Then he would find a way to get the painting back through a more legitimate route. This was the argument that Dan firmly stuck to deduce the next path to find the culprit. While the new investigation team was being established, the painting was once again put up for auction. But this time, it was different. Before anyone could pay for the painting, it had completely disappeared, forever. A very strange disappearance. No one is the owner of it. No one owns it, so where did the painting go? Was it stolen? So who was the thief that could get past hundreds of security guards at the auction, making the painting disappear right before the final hammer fell? This incident has caused the painting to be fabricated with more mysterious stories. Could it be that the painting has become a spirit, a painting that killed its owner and disappeared because it did not want to kill more people? Instead, the last bidder sat there, stunned, thinking that the painting was about to fall into his hands, so that he could once again admire its artistic beauty. After the painting went missing, the case became a big mystery and was left unanswered. Dan also had to temporarily put aside the investigation, along with the case of 3 deaths, because he could not find any related clues. Because all 3 victims lived alone, and had no grudges or conflicts with anyone. Between the time they acquired the painting and their deaths, they had very limited contact with others, so the case reached a dead end and had to be closed. 2 years later, Dan walked slowly on the deserted street. In the cold, foggy night, he suddenly discovered a woman's figure gliding through the night. Her figure looked fragile and graceful, but strangely beautiful. The woman kept looking furtively, looking around as if she was afraid someone would find out. That made Dan very attentive and think that she was doing some kind of evil crime that she didn't want others to find out about. His intuition told him that she was likely going to do something illegal. Dan followed her closely from that moment on. And since he followed her, she seemed to have no idea that there had always been someone following her so closely. She kept walking, looking left and right, without any feeling towards the person lurking and chasing her. Dan kept following her until she stopped in front of a house and sneaked inside. The door of the house was not closed. Dan was a little more careful, looked around and then sneaked in after her. Once inside, he continued walking down the hallway the girl had just entered. Her figure was still lurking ahead and could not leave Dan's eyes. But after walking about 5 meters more, her figure suddenly disappeared, making Dan panic a bit. He still tried to calm down. The end of this corridor was a dead end. So where did that girl finally disappear to? Before Dan could answer that question, something appeared before his eyes, causing him to open his mouth and speak intermittently. Picture. Yes, it is the painting that has been causing a stir in public opinion for many years. It is the mysterious and missing painting of Hong Duong Kam. Dan felt very surprised. Why was it here? Why was it in that woman's house? Where had that woman gone? Not waiting for me to answer the questions. According to my experience as a detective. As soon as I discovered the clue, to be safe and avoid stirring up trouble, Dan retreated, escaped the hallway and left the house. After going out, Dan took the opportunity to carefully memorize the shape of the house, including the address, architecture, and surrounding landscape, not missing a single thing. When he returned to the police station, Dan decided not to tell anyone about this incident and to investigate it himself first. He planned to approach the girl and try to find out why she had the painting. And whether she was the murderer who had previously killed 3 people to steal the painting? Having made the plan, the very next day, Dan followed his memory to return to the old place. It was still the same house, still a luxurious classic French villa. It was located in a quiet neighborhood right next to a cemetery, and there were no other houses around it. The house seemed to have been unattended for a long time, with fallen leaves covering the yard. In addition, patches of plaster paint had also fallen off due to the erosion of time. The house looked completely different during the day and at night, like a light bulb being turned on or off. Last night when he saw the house, it had seemed strangely gloomy, but this morning it looked beautiful and bright. Dan walked closer to the house, and started to raise his hand and knock gently on the wooden door of the house 3 times. Then he stood there silently waiting. But there was no answer, no sound from behind the wooden door. It was still. After waiting for a while without any movement, Dan prepared to knock on the door again. This time the door opened, but Dan did not see anyone. Only a voice came from outside. "What's up? Who are you looking for?" Dan was a bit surprised, not knowing who he was talking to. But last night, before he came here, he had thought of all the convincing reasons and evidence to approach this woman. He adjusted his clothes a bit, then cleared his throat and said, "Hello. I am a person who really loves old houses. The architecture of this house is very beautiful. I want to buy it. I wonder if you..." But before Dan could finish speaking, a voice immediately spoke out very quickly and decisively from inside. "Not for sale." Dan was a bit stunned. At this point, he still hadn't realized that she had just said one sentence and was already using such a tone to chase the customer away. He was afraid it was a bit impolite. But he was still very confident that he would be able to break down her defensive wall. Not to mention Dan's purpose in approaching her. But just talking about Dan's appearance, as well as his talent, before in the police academy. There were many beautiful female police officers who were crazy about him. There were even a few times when Dan was confessed to in the schoolyard. Dan encountered such things a lot. Later when he started working in the unit, there were also many other beautiful girls chasing after Dan, but he still did not accept any of them. He considers himself a noble person, and to choose someone he can develop feelings for, of course, he must also have exceptional qualities. Although Dan had never seen this girl's face, he had only heard her voice. But he guessed that her figure wasn't too bad. And being ugly was fine, being a little ugly would make it easier to approach her. Before coming here, Dan had carefully considered 2 options. 1, if she agreed to sell the house, Dan would use that as an excuse to formally inquire about her every move, including the origin of the painting. 2, if she did not agree, Dan would immediately switch to Plan B, which was to ask to visit the house and flirt with her. Both of these methods can approach the woman to investigate. This is called male scheme. After thinking everything over, Dan continued to speak in an urgent voice. "Okay, if you don't have that intention, could I have a look at this house? I really love ancient architecture, and want to recreate many of those architectural styles somewhere else." Dan finished speaking, then stood still and waited. A long time later there was a response. "Okay, you can come in." The girl agreed to let Dan in, but her tone was not very happy. Dan was full of interest, nodded and walked inside with the elegant steps of a gentleman. When he got there, he saw that the lights in the house were already turned on. An extremely beautiful girl with a high nose, big sparkling eyes and very attractive lips was raising a glass of wine and looking at him provocatively. Dan slightly tilted his head, showing his greeting. Then he approached, not waiting for her to invite him to sit down and talk. He said, "I didn't expect the owner of this house to be such a beautiful and young woman." The girl also tilted her head slightly in response. She said, "Age does not define success." Then she lifted her chin and pointed to a painting hanging on the wall at the end of the hallway. It was visible behind the window. She continued, "Do you know the person who painted that picture? He's very young." Dan pretended to be a little surprised. He slowly turned his head to look at the painting as if seeing it for the first time. He softly exclaimed, "Oh, I have never seen such a beautiful picture in my life." The girl's face slightly darkened. She looked a bit tense and asked Dan, "Do you understand everything the picture shows? Can you see all the problems in it?" Dan kept staring at the painting, and without knowing when, a murderous intent appeared in the girl's eyes as if she wanted to devour Dan if he could not answer according to her intentions. Dan tilted his head slightly, then turned back to look at the girl. At this moment, her face had turned into a smile, hiding the murderous expression just now, a very seductive face looking at Dan. Dan happily replied, "This painting is very beautiful, but perhaps it contains too many profound secrets. I cannot see the problem in it. The person who painted this painting is truly a genius." The girl smiled slightly, her index finger slightly touching her sexy red lips. She said, "Yes, to understand that painting, no matter how much of an art connoisseur you are, it will take at least 2 years to understand what the painting is all about." Dan looked extremely interested. He said, "Oh, what about people who are not into art?" The girl still smiled, a smile that seemed to silently contain murderous intent. Her eyes gradually lit up with determination. She replied, "It only took about 2 years, with my help." The girl said this. Dan immediately felt satisfied. The key to all the problems of the case seemed to be gradually revealed behind the curtain. This girl was definitely related to the secret of that painting. And nothing more, she was very likely the murderer. Dan looked at the girl for a moment and then said politely, "You are such a beautiful person, I want to look at you more. And I also want to come back here many more times to look at that painting. I hope you will allow me." The girl thought for a moment, her eyebrows slightly furrowed. It wasn't because of a sudden proposal from a strange man that made her nervous, but because she was worried about whether her actions towards him were too hasty. Dan waited for a long time but still saw her deep in thought. So he gently reminded her several times to make her understand. After repeating it for the 3rd time, she finally seemed to wake up from her daze. She smiled and replied, "Okay, I agree. But for convenience, please come in the evening. Because I'm not often home during the day." The girl finished speaking and then winked at Dan with a seductive and provocative look like a soldier, telling him to start charging into the battlefield. Dan nodded and politely greeted the girl. "Then I'll take my leave. If it's okay, I'll come back tomorrow night. Please help me understand the painting. If it's okay, I'll invite you to dinner to repay your kindness." The girl thought slowly for a moment, then shook her head and replied, "No need, I'm happy that you came here to see the paintings. It's rare to find someone with the same interests. I don't like going out, just come here and we'll have dinner together. I'll prepare everything to treat you." Dan happily said, "Okay, bye." Having said that, he turned and walked out of the house. As soon as he got out, the wooden door slammed shut. Through this first conversation with her, Dan felt like he had just experienced a sweet taste that he had never tasted before. Returning to the police station, Dan continued to collect all the documents related to the experiment of what an art painting is like. During the conversation with the girl, he seemed very interested in the painting, so in the next meeting, he still needed to prepare a little to present himself as a professional. Only then would the conversation be smooth and natural, making her not suspect that he was investigating her. The next evening, Dan appeared in front of that house again, holding a beautifully arranged bouquet of roses in his hand. When going to a house for dinner, it is always better to bring a gift for the host. Dan thought this was very suitable for the girl living in this old European-style house. She would probably like what Dan did. He raised his hand to the wooden door, and this time knocked 3 more times, evenly. Just like last time, it took a long time before he saw the door open. This time Dan saw the girl appear right in front of him, obviously not like the last time he met her, pretending to be a ghost, making Dan almost lose his soul. She looked at Dan and then smiled seductively and said, "Come in." Dan bowed his head slightly, then politely brought the bouquet with his arm straight and his elbow slightly raised. He brought the bouquet close to her face to let the fragrant scent spread. He said in a very sweet tone, "To you, my future respected art teacher." The girl looked very happy. She took the bouquet of flowers and quickly put it away, put it in a vase and carefully admired it. The two started dinner in a very romantic atmosphere, accompanied by hot topics revolving around art. From then on, Dan began to approach the girl and talk to her every day. He gradually understood more and more about the painting hanging on the wall. The curtains were gradually revealed. But that was not what scared Dan the most. What scared him the most was that his composure in front of the girl gradually disappeared over time. And that the high-priced guy Han Xian Dan had to succumb to the sweet threshold of the woman, to her honeyed temptations. He had fallen in love with her. A year had passed since Dan had started coming here. He felt as if this place was very familiar, like his second home. The same was true for the other woman. She was like a very sweet and virtuous wife. And whenever Dan was around, her feelings were exactly the same as they were in the beginning. Today, Dan stood in front of the house's doorstep again. As soon as he raised his hand to knock, the door opened automatically. It was still the same girl, still the same as a year ago, calm as water, with a familiar yet strange look that had not changed at all. It was her personality that made Dan fall head over heels in love. In his entire life, the handsome and gallant Han Xian Dan had never been so swayed by a woman. The girl looked at him and said, "Please come in." Dan nodded, and as usual it was a bouquet of flowers. Today it was a bouquet of chrysanthemums. The girl quickly took it and continued to put it back in the vase. While the girl was not paying attention, Dan continued to open his diary to record all his activities as a habit. Over the past year, the things he came into contact with, the way the girl expressed herself, as well as his conversations and topics were all clearly recorded. In addition to discovering that he had fallen in love with the girl, he also discovered that in that abstract painting, it turned out that there were hundreds of scenes stacked on top of each other. Each scene was separate, and it took a very deep eye and understanding to see it. And each scene seemed to be painting a story. The scenes were linked together to form a seamless story. Over the past year, Dan had already understood about a third of the profound meaning in the painting, and more of his ability to perceive paintings increased. The curtains behind would be lifted even faster. Dan stepped into the house, feeling the quiet atmosphere and the scent from the girl. A strange, sweet scent, like the scent of oil painting wax. Dan was extremely fond of this scent on her body, and many times he tried to ask her. However, like every other time, she just smiled without responding. A deep mystery in her personality. What secret is she hiding? A year for an investigation. This is extremely unrealistic for a talented detective who solved the case in a flash like Dan. A year has passed and the case of 3 deaths is still at a standstill. And it seems that Dan himself has forgotten that he has to investigate and solve the case, not flirt with that woman. But perhaps the time he spent with her was too much, causing Dan to forget and turn the secondary goal into his main goal. Today, he was preparing sweet words, preparing to confess his love to her. Looking at the girl carrying the luxurious dishes of food, Dan slowly approached her without making a sound, then gently stroked her hair like he was stroking a cat's fur. The girl suddenly turned to look at Dan. The smile on her face disappeared, followed by a confused frown. "What are you doing?" Dan was a bit flustered, but was overcome by passion. He spoke emotionally. "Has anyone told you the story of a student liking his teacher?" The girl tilted her head and said, "I don't think so." If so, that student would have been expelled for being so reckless. Dan opened his eyes wide with interest. He didn't expect her to have such an explanation. He smiled bitterly and said, "So what if I said that most of those stories ended with beautiful love between the two? What would you think?" The girl sat down on the chair, smiled at Dan and said, "In the end, they were so carried away by their love that they lost their sense of morality, and usually when people break the rules, there will always be some price to pay." Dan heard that and immediately understood the deep meaning in this sentence. Basically, she wanted to say that if Dan had that thought about her, it was better to eliminate it before facing the consequences. But Dan could not give up so easily. Telling a gallant man like him to give up a love affair? While he had dozens of other girls pursuing him. Yet just because of her, he gave up everything. Would Dan accept an outcome that did not go his way? He said, "What if that student still defies everything?" Love is sometimes much blinder than what so-called reason tells. The girl thought slowly, then suddenly mentioned a problem. She asked, "Do you remember the third scene in the picture?" Dan nodded. "I remember, but why?" The girl said, "It's also a fox sitting on the steps of a cave, the cave of the king of the jungle. But what happens when it realizes that the king of the jungle has feelings for it?" In the fourth scene? Dan was a little surprised thinking about this problem. He suddenly remembered the third scene depicted in the painting, a fox sitting in front of a tiger's den. But then in the fourth scene, that fox was dead. Only a skeleton remained right under a tiger's feet. There was only one thing he still couldn't understand, so he asked the girl again. The fox died, but that cannot be completely confirmed that it was the tiger's doing. In the fourth scene, the tiger also shed tears over the fox's skeleton? The girl sighed and explained. In love, people are sometimes blind to the fate that has been arranged. And when they disregard that, paradox will come to them. When the tiger realized that it also had feelings for the fox, it had already killed the fox with its own hands. Because it saw the fox appear in front of its cave every day, it was very angry, but until one day when it had killed the fox, it felt nostalgic for the fox's figure. And that was also the punishment for those who did not believe in fate and blindly devoted themselves to stupid feelings. Dan was silent. Perhaps he should stop the topic here. Because her answer was too obvious. Dan sat down again, tried to smile at her and said, "It seems we have returned to the first scenes of the picture. Perhaps we should explore the next scenes. The problem of foxes and tigers is something we have discussed many times in the past year." The girl smiled again and said, "Yes, although the story of the fox and the tiger are just side stories. But they are the foundation for building such a great work of art. Perhaps I have never told you that, to understand the whole picture, you need to understand the story of the fox and the tiger. It is a master key." The girl tilted her head again, stood up, led Dan closer to the painting, and pointed at the painting again and urged Dan. "Now, try to look at this picture and see what the next scene is. It will be very useful if you know how to apply the discussion just now." Dan listened and immediately looked up at the painting. He tilted his head slightly in surprise, because he could clearly see that there was a pair of eyes in the fox's skeleton. Changing the scene a bit, starting from the eyes in the general view, he could see a tiger lying peacefully and quietly in the belly of an elephant. The girl asked again, "What's wrong? What do you see now?" Dan stammered in reply. "Strange, why do I see an elephant, a very giant elephant? And a little further, there is a tiger with very long fangs." The girl replied, "That elephant is a mammoth, and that tiger is a saber-toothed tiger from prehistoric times. The saber-toothed tiger in this scene resembles the fox in the third and fourth pictures." Dan nodded in understanding. It turned out that things sometimes had a cause and effect for many things. It was very possible that the fox was a mammoth in its previous life, and in its next life it was to repay the debt to the tiger. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that this picture was very profound. Thinking back to everything up to now, Dan still felt that there were too many things deeply embedded in it. Not only from the painting, but also from the girl. It seemed that his previous conversations, whether he wanted it or not, would always become topics related to the painting. And it seemed that no matter how he deliberately opened the topic, he could still make that discussion become the key to open the next curtain. Could it be that, like her, this was really fate? Another year passed. Dan still had deep feelings for her. He completely changed, from a cold person who was not interested in any beautiful girl. Now, he was crazy about her and gradually became a weak and lovesick guy to the point of madness. What could be more miserable than seeing the person you like every day, but not being able to confess? And what about her? She was no different from the first days Dan met her, still a girl with an indescribable coldness, a mysterious charm. And 2 years had passed, that mystery had never diminished. She was truly a person with a terrifyingly deep mind. Dan folded up the diary. He had recorded everything he had encountered in the past 2 years, and temporarily left it on the table. He prepared everything to continue to that ancient villa. Today is a day more solemn than any other. Because today will be the final curtain lifted, the final scene in the painting. It is the moment when everything will be revealed, even the deaths of the 3 people before. What is death from extreme fear, after all? However, that was not what Dan cared about the most. What he cared about the most was that today, he would confess his love to her. No matter where her spears were directed. But there was no stopping it anymore. Today would be his last chance. After tomorrow, when the whole picture was explained, he would no longer have any reason to go see her. He placed the diary on the table, along with a letter with a few lines written on it. Dan thought about whether he would meet the same end as the previous 3 people. So he left behind one last clue for the next person. If he happened to read it, he might also find the answer. Walking to the front door of the villa, the wooden door opened again. This time Dan gave a bouquet of roses just like the first day, but 99 roses. The girl took the bouquet of flowers from Dan's hand, looked at it and frowned. She said, "If something still forces you to go against fate, then I'm not sure you can be safe." Dan tilted his head and said, "Safe, I don't have that anymore. Faced with the damage from your beautiful eyes, my fragile shield has completely collapsed. Love me." Dan carefully said each word with great passion. The girl's cheeks suddenly turned red. She lowered her head and said nothing. Dan gently lifted her chin and gently placed a sweet kiss on her lips. Then he said, "If once the student likes the teacher, can the teacher stop him?" The girl blushed and shyly shook her head and said, "Can't stop." Dan asked again with interest, "So should I respond to that feeling?" The girl was silent, her eyes like autumn leaves sparkling. The two stood there staring at each other for a long time. After a long time, he sighed and said 3 words. "Come in." Then she turned around and picked up the flower and put it in the familiar vase. At this moment, the expression on her face was indescribable. A mixture of emotions welled up inside her. She silently shed tears without Dan knowing. Another minute passed. Dan quietly went to look at the painting. And this time, without waiting for the girl to remind him, he immediately used all the details of this fateful meeting, looking at the painting to deduce it. He looked slowly at the last painting, the 100th scene in the painting. A new person has completely appeared in this painting, not the usual animals. But a person, more precisely a painter. He is painting other pictures on the whole scene of this large painting. Each layer of oil paint is built up on each other, making it extremely grand and obscure. Suddenly, Dan noticed a point, that the artist's face when he added the final stroke showed extreme surprise and astonishment. Dan looked deeply into the picture he was drawing, and saw that he was drawing himself collapsing in front of a picture he had also drawn. Everything piled up on top of each other, making it extremely confusing but also very interesting. But then Dan thought back to all the events in the painting. His expression also changed to one of shock no less than the other painters. He discovered that the artist was none other than Ha Duong Kam. He was the one who painted this magnificent picture. In his eyes, every moment in the 100th scene, Ha Duong Kam seemed to be really alive. He screamed continuously with a very miserable look. And from the 1.5 picture onwards, everything was very vivid. Each death, each victim, how they died before their crazy screams. Like a very long film clip inserted in the film from the picture that Ha Duong Cam drew in the picture. Another point is that in each picture when the person is about to die, there is a woman standing next to them. Sweat began to flow down Dan's shirt. When he looked at the fourth scene, a completely different man was also terrified by the painting. And that man seemed to be standing in Dan's place, screaming in terror to death. Next to him, there was also the same girl. Finally, when he could recognize who the girl was who always appeared in the paintings, he also saw the odd-numbered painting. And the person standing in it was none other than himself, Hong Xiandan. When he discovered the terrible truth, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It belonged to the girl he loved so much, and also the girl who kept appearing in the painting. When she finished placing her hand on Dan's shoulder, blood was flowing from his eyes. He had suffered a brain hemorrhage from fear and died. The corpse was cold, with eyes wide with horror and disbelief. Just like the others before him, he had died the same way. 4 lives had passed, and now it was his turn to be the 5th. In that painting, there was a 4th man who also died. But why is he not known? Perhaps he is the 4th owner of this painting. After Dan died, people quickly found his body thanks to the diary left on his desk. The case of Dan's sudden death in front of the painting was exactly like the cases 4 years ago, causing people to have many doubts. People also discovered the body of another man right next to Dan. But the only thing was that his body had turned into bones. That proved that 2 years before that, he also died in a similar way to Dan. He could be the master thief who stole the painting at the auction. And that the number of people who died in front of this painting was not different. It was regular with a gap of 2 years, taking the life of its owner. A new investigator was assigned to investigate the mystery of this painting. His name was Dao Van Duc, also a top detective in the industry. Chin Duc was Dan's subordinate, and he was the one who discovered the secret notebook recording the time he and the woman talked. It also revealed part of the reason why Dan had to die. Was it because he confided in the woman? No, Duc thought it was because Dan had explained the terrible secret in the painting, and he had to die in the same way his predecessors had. Duc was worried and hesitant, but the answer to that terrible secret urged him even more. Since Dan's death, the painting has been sealed and hidden in a secluded place, unknown to anyone. Only Duc, the person in charge of this, can see the painting and learn the secret hidden within it. The painting was hidden deep in a top-secret basement of the city police department. And only Duc was the only one who had the key to get in there to find out. Before that, Duc had spent quite a long time researching art paintings. When Dan had just died and Duc took over this case, he could easily recognize 20 of the more than 100 scenes that this painting depicted. In Duc's life, this was the first time he had seen such a great painting. A giant painting that was abstract, profound, and absolutely beautiful. When he first saw the picture, Duc was so happy that he couldn't eat or sleep. But then he realized the truth, that the girl in the diary that Dan mentioned had really appeared. The first night he was working on the painting, she appeared right behind him in a policewoman uniform, which did not raise any suspicions. However, he soon found out that no policewoman had been assigned to work with him. That could only be explained by the fact that the woman had transformed herself. Yes, that was the woman who caused Dan to die an unnatural death. And she had no idea that before Dan died, he had left a diary for Duc, and in that diary, Dan had accused everything, and her facial features were unmistakable. Duc had guessed everything and still pretended not to understand what was happening. Still pretending that he believed that she was really someone sent from the ministry to coordinate the investigation. Duc did not let any flaws be revealed. That girl seemed very normal. But Duc was different from Dan. He was not blinded by love and lost his mind. It could only be because Dan loved her too much that he could not realize that this woman had a somewhat dull look. Not as flexible as a normal person. One day, Duc turned back to the first page of his diary and discovered that in the first conversation between Dan and her, a very important detail had been mentioned. And this detail was not mentioned again by Dan until the entire journey that followed. That detail says that this woman only wants to see Dan at night. So what about during the day? Duck asked himself that question. Until now he had pretended to be stupid and an art-blind person in front of her. He said he could only see a few paintings under her guidance. But in fact Duck could see up to the 99th scene. Just a little more, if Duck tried, he could completely see what the 100th scene would depict in this painting. But Duck did not do that. He was completely cautious with all his actions. If this girl could not appear during the day, then he just needed to quietly wait until the day and take her outside to examine her carefully to be able to see everything clearly. Confident in his guess, the very next day Germany acted according to his calculated plan. And this time his calculation was correct. She did not appear in the sunlight. Just like in the other picture, the 100th scene was also quickly seen by Duck. When he discovered everything, he was also surprised. Luckily for him, he chose the right time to examine it. Otherwise, he might have encountered the same result as the previous people. Duck finished watching the final scene and finally realized that he was the one standing in it. Only now he didn't roll over and die. Looking again, Duck could vaguely see a line of words as if warning him. If you look out and don't die like us, please turn the picture over and look at the back. The words did indeed convey that meaning. Duck did not hesitate any longer but immediately did as he was told. He turned the painting upside down and removed it from the frame. Another line of black text appeared. This line was left by the person who drew it, in Ha Duong Kam's handwriting. The line read, "It's a demon painting. If I die, please meet Master Tik Thiet Tam." The end of that line immediately raised a question for Duck. What is the devil? And who is Tik Thiet Tam to know this clearly? And where to find that person? Duck first put that thought aside and immediately returned to his office. He typed in the name of the great monk Tik Thiet Tam to search. Luckily for him, he was very famous among Buddhist monks and nuns and could easily be found. Great Master Tik Thiet Tam is located at Lien Phai Pagoda, also right in the city center, very easy to find. On that very day, Duck immediately planned to go find him. When he arrived, he saw the monk sweeping the temple. He even brought the painting with him to show him. At first, when he met Duck, he pretended to be confused and refused to see him. But when he showed him the painting, he was immediately surprised. Then he pulled Duck into the temple and asked him in detail. "Where did you find this picture?" Duck said, "It's a long story, I just need to know one thing. What is the relationship between the master and the painter Ha Duong Kam?" The Grand Master shook his head and sighed, saying, "Is there any relationship? If there is, it is the master-disciple relationship between us." That year, he came back from studying painting abroad. During a visit to the temple, he immediately liked the way I conveyed it into ancient paintings and immediately became my teacher. Duck asked again. So what he said here mentioned the devil of calamity. What is the devil of calamity? The gray-faced master replied. It is a demon formed according to ancient drawings, those are forbidden drawings. It did not listen to me and kept dreaming. Legend has it that the painter of the Tran dynasty could draw a picture leading to the fairyland. Those who later learned to draw according to those drawings all drew demons. And they all had untimely deaths. The master paused for a moment and asked again. You didn't look at the last detail, did you? Duck said. I saw everything. Even how the demon killed people. The gray-faced master said. Then I can't save you anymore, the one who saw the last paintings. Half of your soul has been absorbed into the painting. Then I can't burn the painting anymore. Because burning it would mean killing you. No one can live with only half a soul. After the master finished speaking, he immediately sent Duck away. Duck did not listen, nor did he think it was right. He took the painting back to his hometown that same night, and found a person in the area who was famous for the art of exorcism. Although he had never believed in superstitions because he was a police officer, this time the matter was too mysterious, so he had no choice but to use folk methods to explain it. Duck sought out several people in this profession, but most of them did not know. There was only one last person he met. He was a very knowledgeable person, but he gave him the same advice as the great master. He told him to take good care of the funeral, and that he did not have much time left. Duc still did not believe this, but still wanted to try to arrange things for himself. He wrote a suicide note to prepare for any unfortunate situations. Then he went to find Mr. Trin, asked him to keep it for him and told him that if anything happened to him that night, he should immediately follow the last wishes in the letter. Then he sat there quietly, sitting in the deserted cemetery at night, quietly waiting with the flashlight shining on the scene of the painting. The darkness gradually fell, followed by the terrible screeching sounds of owls. The next terrifying thing also happened to Duc. When he had just turned back to look at the painting, it was also the moment when from within, one by one, flickering figures appeared. A beautiful girl stepped out of the painting, making Duc lose his mind. She walked in front of Duc, a little closer, then raised her head and turned back. Duc's eyes opened wide in fear, blood flowing from his eyes. His hands involuntarily reached up to his two pairs of people, then poked deep inside. His eyes were shot out, blood gushed from Duc's mouth. He raised his hand to his neck and strangled himself to death. At that moment, Old Man Trin saw him commit suicide and shouted, "Duc, what are you doing?" Elder Trin was extremely frightened and ran over, but Duc had stopped breathing. There was no longer any sign of life. In the painting, there was another completed stroke. Anyone with an eye for art could see it. The painting depicted a girl walking out of the painting, her head turned upside down. All her facial features were also upside down. She reached out to gouge out the boy's eyes and strangle him. Old Trin sighed and buried Duc's body in a separate location. After reading his brother's suicide note, he understood the whole story.